What's up guys? So today is the beginning of a short series of 3 videos where I'm going to be going over the 3 different Switch consoles that are out right now. This is the Lite, there's the normal V1/V2 Switch console, and then there's the OLED consoles. We're going to be taking a look at how to install this chip here, which is going to allow us to boot instead of from the internal memory of the console. We'll be able to boot from the SD card. The benefit of being able to do this is that we can use certain tools that the community has created to read the eMMC, and we'll take a look at some of the other tools available. Regardless of the Switch model, there are 3 chips on the board that are married to each other and cannot be replaced. That includes the APU, the eMMC, and this security chip right here. This has some keys on it that are paired to the APU and the eMMC, and the software on the eMMC chip is also paired to the APU and this chip right here. So normally you wouldn't be able to replace the eMMC module even if you do get a working new one. So if the eMMC goes bad, generally your Switch board is now a donor board. That being said, that's not entirely the case with the help of this. This has a lot of implications for the capabilities of repair with the Switch console and potentially being able to replace the eMMC if it's either broken or going bad. And now let's get the console open. Before we do anything else, we are going to want to unplug the battery. So let me just show you how to do that. This is the only version of the console where you need to unplug a ribbon cable before you can unplug the battery connector, because the battery connector is underneath this one here. So you can just grab a plastic spudger or your nail and pop this connector up, and then you can just use your fingers to gently remove it. And I like to use the pointy part of my spudger here to just pull up on the battery connector just like that. And we can bend it out of the way a little bit and the console is safe to work on. All right, so before doing anything else, I recommend just getting rid of all of the thermal paste in sight. I despise thermal paste. It gets everywhere if you're working on something. So I'll just use my plastic spudger to get as much of it off. I recommend you don't use IPA right away on the thermal paste. Get as much as you possibly can off with your plastic spudger or a Q-tip because it's significantly easier to pick up and clean when it is dry. If you come in right away with IPA, it's going to spread all of the thermal paste everywhere, all over the board, and it's going to be significantly harder to clean. So once you have the majority of it off, I'll just grab a Kim wipe with some alcohol and wipe up the remainder. So there we go, that's all cleaned. And we'll put this cover aside. All right, so to install this, normally you wouldn't have to take out the whole motherboard. In this case, since I am replacing this joystick here, I am going to be taking out the whole board. And I recommend for all the screws that are Phillips head and this console, a Phillips 000. This is going to fit the best. It's really easy if you don't have the correct sized screwdriver to accidentally strip these screws. Some of them can be sometimes pretty tight in there, and it's way easier than you'd think to strip them. Before I remove the heatsink, I recommend just grabbing a little bit of alcohol and dumping some on this little foam thing here. This has a bunch of glue under it, and it can be a little bit difficult to remove without ripping. So we'll take these 3 heatsink screws out, and I'm going to lift up gently on here to separate the thermal paste. And then don't pull up on this because you will just like bend this really soft copper tubing here. You're going to want to gently pull up on the foam that's glued to the fan here. It's really hard to do this without ripping the foam, but it's not that big of a deal if you do. I just like to try to be neat with it. So there we go, that's all separated. And once that's separated, this one will sort of just come out nicely. So there we go. That's out. And again, right away, I'm just going to go ahead and clean the thermal paste without IPA. You can see a lot of it just sort of comes off in chunks if you don't use any alcohol at first. Super helpful. So nice and clean. You also want to be careful not to scrape up the copper on top of here. Again, it's very soft and you can easily damage the surface of this with any sort of tool. So I recommend being very gentle, otherwise you can damage the cooling capability of the heatsink. Now we have to remove the game cartridge and the headphone jack here. So Let's go ahead and do that. And I'm just gonna pull up on this little connector with my nail, and you can gently wiggle this out. So this is just sort of two boards connected by a flex cable here. And we can finally replace our joystick. I mentioned to the customer that I only have the black ones in stock and that I could order a white one, but he just wanted me to replace it with the black one. So we're just gonna go ahead and do that. All right, this looks extremely ugly, but I sent a picture to the customer to make sure they are positive that they don't want me to order a new one or replace the other thumbstick as well, so they at least match. So we'll see what he says. All right, so the customer said to go ahead and just replace both. I offered to replace the other one free of charge because it looked pretty ugly, but now they both look ugly. I sent a picture to the guy and he's happy with it, so more power to him. Okay, on to the installation. We need to remove this APU shield. Don't try to just like pry this up with tweezers and things. You're going to absolutely demolish it and very likely knock components off the board. I'll show you a really easy way to get this off every single time with no issues. So you're gonna need a microscope for this. I mean, you'll need one anyways for the rest of the job. But what we're looking for are these locks right here. So what you're gonna wanna grab is just a pin like this, like a sewing needle. The smallest one you can find, ideally. You're gonna take the point of the needle and stick it right in the corner of the lock right here and just pull out, and go on the other side and do the same thing. And you just want to make sure that this lock clears the bump here. So I'll pull that out a tiny bit more, like that. That's perfect. And be very careful because there's a lot of traces around here, so don't put a lot of pressure so you don't slip and tear through traces. We don't want this to turn into a trace repair job. Stick it in the corner, just like that. No reason to rush with this. If you try to just pry this thing off, you are going to spend longer getting it off and damage at least the shield, if not more parts of the console. And I don't recommend doing this with your tweezers because you'll bend up your tweezers real nice doing this. Grab yourself a pin. Perfect. So now that all of the locks are undone like that, get on one of these corners now and just pull up like that with your nail. You can also use plastic spudger for this. Just go around and undo the three corners here. And now you should just be able to sort of gently peel the, sometimes this will be harder than other times, but you have to peel up on the thermal paste under here. And then the whole thing will just come off real easy, just like that. Clean this up first with a dry Q-tip as best you can. That's fine. And then we'll come in with alcohol and just do circular motions like this. Again, this is a very soft copper, so don't scrape this with a spudger or something. Cool. So before we put this aside, I'm going to just grab the end of my brush or some round tool and just push them all back in so they're straight again. That way, when we put it back on, it will lock onto the APU again. So this is good. We can put this aside. Same deal for the thermal paste here. Just take a dry Q-tip and just go in between the row of capacitors and the die, just like this. Get as much off as you can. Same on the die. And now we can come in with alcohol. And the best way I found to do this is grab a brush that's about this size and do circular motions on top of the capacitors. Just like this. Then you're going to have a big mix of alcohol and thermal paste, and you can grab a Kim wipe and mop as much of it up as you can. Cool. And this is nice and cleaned up. So we need this to be super clean because we need to solder to these capacitors down here. So here is the chip. You need to grab the one for the OLED. So this one, not the other one that looks like this. This one with the ribbon cable. This is only for the V1 and V2 consoles where you can unplug the eMMC and plug it into the chip. And what we need is this flex cable right here for the CPU. It looks like this. One of the other things that I don't have in this particular kit, but I have plenty of spares, are the light adapters. So you're gonna need an adapter that looks like this. You don't need this. You can wire up these points manually with some wire. This just kind of makes your life a bit easier. So here's the flex cable we're gonna be using for the light. So we need this. We need this for the CPU. And we need this. And essentially what this is doing is this is giving us some points on the APU, and this is giving us some points to connect to the eMMC on the board. All right, so next we're gonna grab the APU flex cable here. Just gonna put these aside for now, and we'll go back under the microscope. And you need to route this in this direction. Route this flex cable underneath the shield here and pull it through. And you need to clear this metal backing underneath here and then push these two tabs underneath the shield here. And these don't always have perfect sort of like alignment. This one's actually pretty solid. Sometimes you'll find the gap here for these capacitors are a little too small, so you just have to like bend it around the caps a little bit, but in this case we're looking pretty good. I'm gonna set my iron to 375. I'm gonna tin my iron with a bit of leaded solder, and we'll put some flux here on these 4 points, and we just need to realign this and get this underneath. There we go. Perfect. And I'm going to press down with my tweezers while soldering the points. So that's fine for now, just to get this thing anchored. That's good. It's good. Good for now. I'm going to go over those again, but before I do that, I'm going to boost my iron temp to 425. This is just so we can have enough heat to heat up this shield at the same time as that pad. And these are just to prevent the flex cable from yanking on those caps. You want to make sure there's not too much excess solder on these. So I'm just going to go over it like that. You just don't want to make a big bump of solder here so you can't put the APU shield back on, but this is okay. And now we're going to zoom in a little bit more and make sure these joints are looking good. So if this one's fine, I'm not going to touch this one here. You can see it's fully touching the cap and fully touching the pad here. That's great. The only points that actually matter on this flex cable, outside of at least one ground connection, which these two are providing, the outside 2 points of each of the caps are also ground. But as long as you have one ground soldered properly, and the inside of both of these are the main points we need to make sure are connected. So this one and this one. This is a good looking joint. This is not, you can see it's not quite, this would work, but it's not a good joint. So we'll go over that again. I'm going to put my iron back down to 375 so we're not applying too much heat to this cap. And again, we just want to put a little bit of pressure down with our tweezers on the flex cable while we solder just like that. So yeah, that's a better joint going between the cap and the pad. And while we're here, I'll just touch up the ground one there. That's good. That's looking great. So this is a perfectly well installed APU adapter. What I'm going to do is warm up this flux with 160 degree hot air just to make it easier for us to clean. Especially around this adapter, it can be a little difficult to clean up the flux here, so just going to warm it like that. And combine it with alcohol and then soak it up with a Kim wipe. Flux and alcohol likes to just sort of get trapped underneath this flex cable. You can see if I press down on this, there's still some liquid underneath it. I like to try to clean this up as best as I can. So what I like to do is just grab a Q-tip and get some alcohol on it and apply heat while rolling over and putting pressure on the flex cable. This is going to kind of squeeze out some of the excess flux. So the next thing we want to do here is grab some Kapton tape, and I'm going to just make sure we cover these two caps to avoid shorting it out to the shield that we're going to put back on. So what I like to do here is take a bit of Kapton tape like this, and I'm going to cut it down to size. And then I'm going to cut it lengthwise. We don't need this whole thing, so I'm going to cut it like this. And this is a perfect size just to pop right on here. I just line the straight side of the tape up with the bottom of the APU die and then place it down. So that's looking good. We can move on to the next area, which is going to be over here. So this is going to sort of sit here a little bit like this. So you can see the top of that cap there is where we're going to get the 3.3 volts. And then we're going to get a few of these points down here. So the C point there is going to be your DAT0 point. The A point is going to be the command. D is going to be clock. And then B is reset. And then you have ground also, which is important to connect up. So let's put some flux on those points. So we have this one. Well, let's just put it all over here. So I'm going to stop using the knife tip now, and we're going to go with the bent conical tip, which is a little bit more precise because these points are pretty small, and I'll stick with 375. So again, it's this point here that we need to scrape to get some of that coating off of it, and we're just going to go over it. We tinned the wrong point there, but it's fine. There we go. All right, and then we have these two that we need to do. So I'm going to scrape back at these pads. Again, just gently scraping with the iron, which will remove some of that coating. And I'll tin my iron again and come in and tin the pads. Great, so we have all of those tinned. I'm going to cut a tiny piece of braid, but I'm going to cut it sort of at an angle like this. And I'm going to boost my iron temp to 425. With this small tip, it takes a lot to actually use braid. All right, and I'll tin my iron a bit and just touch the solder there. That's plenty. I just don't want it to be a blob getting in the way of the flex cable, so that's fine. All right, we have to tin the reset point over here, and I'm gonna switch back to the knife tip for this, just a bit bigger of a pad. And again, we're gonna tin it. And again, you can see you have to scrape it a little bit for it to actually tin. Cool. Okay, and now we can do a little bit of cleanup over here. All right, I'm not going too crazy with cleanup here because we are going to be soldering a bit more. And I don't recommend trying to do this without tinning those pads first. You're going to have a hell of a time. So again, flux, and I'm going to connect that, and we have to move it a tiny bit. Perfect. And same thing with this one, you want to put pressure downwards with some tweezers on the flex cable while you are soldering it, so it actually makes contact with the pads. And so you're not just tinning the flex cable. All right. Now the reset point. Let me zoom in here and just go over that one more time. All right, that's a good chunk of solder, but obviously we need more flux for that to be a good joint. Just gonna drench this. Beautiful. And then we have to bump our iron temp up to get this ground point going. So 475 again, or sorry, 425 again. To do this, just tin your iron a bunch and hold against the pad and against the APU shield thing here. I need to heat both up so that the solder adheres. Cool, so this is well connected over here, and we can clean this area. So again, just using some heat to melt the flux. Try not to get flux in that FPC connector there. You don't really want flux in those, because they are really annoying to clean out. And flux is non-conductive, which is awesome, but not so awesome when it's in a port that needs to conduct. Okay, and then now we have to go over here, and we gotta solder this point here, and also some of these just anchoring points. These other points here aren't important on the edge, they're just to anchor the flex cable down so you don't rip up the points. And then we'll go and press down again, and that is perfect. Can also try to put some solder there, not too much, just enough to anchor it. That's fine. Let's get this in focus here, and the same goes for this. All right, can probably use a bit more flux here. Good stuff. And again, we're just going to heat up the area. Try not to blow flux into that FPC connector there for the game cartridge. Cool, so all of our points are looking good. Okay, next we need to bend a few things on this so that it doesn't crush the flex cable here, and so it doesn't get in the way of this ground point here. So we're going to be bending this top left corner here, the 3 tabs on the top left, so this can go flat back on. And then we're also going to bend this lock right here on the bottom right, which lines up perfectly with this flex cable. So just use some needle nose pliers and bend in the top 3. Just like this. And then we're going to do the same thing for this bottom right lock here. Okay, and before we put it back on, just clean the die with some isopropyl. Gonna put a dot of thermal paste on here. Make sure it's enough so that it will cover the entire die when you press it down. So we're just gonna lift up on this flex cable and push this down on the APU to spread out that thermal paste. And then you can slowly go around and start clicking in these locks that we bent back in place. And there we go, perfectly on there. Now I'm just gonna clean up this a little bit with some isopropyl because we need to adhere the chip to it. And I'm gonna take this, we're gonna put some double-sided tape on the back. And I like to layer about like 4 pieces of double-sided tape because one layer of double-sided tape doesn't generally provide enough thickness to properly adhere the sort of difference in heights of this shield to the back of the chip. Put this on there like that and then cut the excess off with the ceramic scissors, just like this. First, close the lock. And as you're putting this down, make sure this is lined up with this. And then also make sure the chip is as far this way as you can go because you don't want to get in the way of the heatsink. So hanging off of the APU shield a tiny bit is perfect. And then you can put some slight pressure on the chip to adhere it down. Sort of flip it upside down like this and plug it in. Lock it down. And what I like to do with this is just put a little bit of pressure on the bent part so it's not trying to pull itself out of the connector there. Okay, and before we plug the battery in to test, we're just going to do some diode mode measurements on all these points up here. These are all the points that we soldered to before. So we're going to go into diode mode, put red on ground. I like to use a screw like this for it. And we're going to check the 3.3 point with our black probe. That looks good. Then clock. 0.4 looks good. Command. Good. Data 0. Good. This is reset. That's great. And then we have ground, which is good. And we can also check the CPU point down here, which also looks good. Okay, so this is safe to plug in and test. Perfect. And then power. And we get a blue light followed by a solid white light. And then we're gonna get a blue flashing light like this. And then finally one last flash. And that means it's worked. And you can see we get a no SD card screen here. So it's trying to boot from the SD card and it doesn't detect one because obviously we don't have one plugged in. And one thing we want to do here before reassembling the console is press both volume buttons, and this should boot into the official firmware. So we can just turn this off. And if it boots into the official firmware like that, this just verifies that your installation is good and that the chip is good. I've had faulty chips where they won't boot into official firmware. Obviously, you can only do that test if the console is like in a functional state. And every time you turn off the console from the official firmware, it will always turn on sort of again in like some kind of standby mode. So again, if we press power, and you could see it went faster that time. So the chip actually learns this particular console, and every time you boot it, it will do this faster. So I'll press power once and it will turn off the console. And then we can go in and unplug the battery again to get the console reassembled. Cool. So before I start reassembling the console, I'm going to cover this whole thing in Kapton tape. Make sure to bend the lock down on the USB connector there. And I like to put the tape overlapping with the APU shield a bit because we're going to be putting this back on here. And this is going to be very close to here, and I don't want this shorting anything. All right, so there we go. It's covered in Kapton tape, which is great. And then we have to line up this shield with where it's going to go, which is right here. And we need to cut a hole in the shield right here to make room for the chip. So it's going to be right on the edge of this little bent piece here, and then a little bit past this bent up piece here. And this is where a nice heavy duty pair of scissors is going to come in handy, or tin snips or something. So again, right on the edge of this, and again on this side. All right, and you have to cut a little bit past where you need to cut so that you can cut this way. I don't recommend bending back and forth a bunch until it comes off, just because you're going to create a bunch of metal shavings. So we're going to take the needle nose pliers here and just flatten this all out. There's some metal shavings anyways that we have to clean up. So I'll just use a Q-tip and clean all of these cut areas. All right, perfect. So this should go right back on here without causing any issues for our chip, which is good. All right, so now we're gonna double check that this is routed correctly. Cool, so now we can reassemble the console like normal. And when you're putting the heatsink back on, don't screw the screws down all the way. Just screw them in a tiny bit so it's nice and lined up. And then you can bottom out the 3 screws. And then we just have to plug in the battery and the remaining flex cable. And then we can put a tiny bit of thermal paste on here to transfer the heat to the shield. So I'll throw the back cover on this and we'll get started with the software stuff. Okay, good stuff. So this is ready to go for the SD card that we prepared. I'm gonna throw that in the console. And what's gonna happen is it's going to boot from a payload on the SD card, and we'll go into this bootloader called Hecate. You can set the date and stuff if you want. I'll just skip that. So I'm not gonna go through everything possible, but I'll just go through some of the more repair focused things really quick here. I'll be referring back to these videos for how to get to this point, because there'll be certain instructions for backing up and restoring the NAND and things like that you'll need to have this much done for. So just more generally, this is a super useful tool here, console info. And if you click eMMC, you can see all the information about the eMMC that's installed. You can see this one's a Samsung eMMC. You can also see the partitions on the actual eMMC here. One of the other important things here is how fast the eMMC is running. You should see both of these at 400 megabytes per second. If you don't see this and it's like 200 or running in slow mode, you might get a pop-up on the screen, and that can indicate something is wrong with your eMMC or something is wrong with the wiring. You also have micro SD card info. This is very useful for figuring out if you have a legitimate SD card. So for example, you can see vendor ID here says SanDisk. If you have a fake like Chinese SD card that is not actually the size that it says it is, you'll get a warning here that says fake SD. If you see that, immediately turn the console off and use a genuine SD card. I have firsthand seen fake SD cards break consoles and corrupt NANDs and things, because with the fake ones, it'll say it's like 1 terabyte or 2 terabytes or something. And what it does is it tricks the device into thinking it's bigger than it is. They're actually usually only like 1632 gigs. And as soon as you write more data than that to it, it will start overwriting the beginning of the SD card. And that causes all sorts of problems, especially if you're booting from the SD card. So yeah, just be careful and be aware of that. And then you also have battery information here, which is cool. You also have hardware and fuse counts here. So you can see that there are 20 burnt fuses, which means that we should be on 19.0.0 or above, and that is accurate. These are actually physical fuses on the APU that will burn when you update the console. This is their way of preventing you from downgrading firmwares, essentially. So if you do end up writing a lower firmware than the matched amount of fuses that should be burnt for that firmware, you won't be able to boot the console in the normal way, and the console will just go into recovery mode as soon as you try to boot it, and you won't see anything on the screen. You can also see information here about the RAM and the panel. Again, I'm not going to go over absolutely everything. And the other thing I'll show you that is important here is backing up and restoring to and from the eMMC. So let's back up the eMMC, and there's two parts of the backup we want to do. One is boot 0 and boot 1. This one's pretty quick. It'll just check the size of the SD card, and then it will back up boot 0 and boot 1. There it is, it's done. You can click close. And then this is going to back up the 29/30 gig partition for all of the other data on the eMMC. So we're just going to click that raw GBP. And this is going to take about 20 or 30 minutes for the Switch and for the V1, V2 consoles. It'll take a bit longer for the OLED because you have a 60 gigabyte NAND. And make sure your battery is charged while you're doing this. You don't want the console to be shutting off in the middle of this. And if it's not charged when you plug it in, just make sure it's the official charger or one that is a PD charger that can provide enough current to actually charge the console while it's backing up. You can see on the bottom right here, it's showing you how much the battery is getting used. If you plug in a charger that's not powerful enough, this will stay red and negative. But if you plug in a charger that is powerful enough, you'll see this turn green, and that just indicates that it's charging faster than it's using the battery. And I think it verifies each of the parts after it backs them up. So this is just going through and verifying after backing up that first part of the dump. Because we're in FAT32, it can't put this entire thing in one file. So it's going to back up this entire NAND in like a bunch of different parts. On the computer, there is a tool you can use to combine those parts into one file if you need to. So I'm just going to let this do its thing, and we'll come back once it's done. Okay, so once the backup is done, you can just close out of it, and it will be stored in a /backups folder. You can also restore that backup to the NAND by just putting all of those backup files into the restore folder that are right next to the backup files. And then by clicking this restore button here, and you can separately restore boot 0 and boot 1 and then the raw GPP. There is a whole host of other things you can do with the bootloader here and all sorts of other tools. I'm not going to go over any of that, but I will be referring back to this video for some future repair videos where I am replacing the eMMC of a console or that sort of thing. I'll be using this tool, and I'll refer back to this video and the other videos for the other console models, which will instruct you how to get to this point. So this will be the end of the video. I appreciate you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.